Hello everybody, this is the first part in the series Consuming a REST API with Flutter. In the first part we're going to create and implement the login page. For this series we will use the JSON placeholder API so we wouldn't have to create our own. Here I have an empty project with just the app class created. Okay, the first thing we should do is create the login page. We'll make it a stateful widget since we're going to have to remember when we're loading or not. Okay, now let's add the isLoading property. Okay, now let's build a scaffold with the app bar. Alright, now that that's done, we should create a single text field where the user is going to import their username, and also we should create the login button. Since these elements are going to be laid out vertically, we'll use the column widget to do that. Okay, now that we have this, let's try running the app to see how this looks. Now that we have our app up and running, we can see that this all looks a little bit ugly. So the first thing we should do is add some padding. Okay, now this looks a little bit better. And also let's set our login text to be white. Alright, now we should also center all of this. We're going to use the main axis alignment property of our column and set it to be center so our widgets will be vertically centered. Alright, now that looks a little bit better. Now let's resize our button. I want to increase its height and make its width equal to the width of the text field. For resizing our button we can use the sized box widget. Basically, we will pass in the height and the width we desire into our sized box, and the sized box will force its children to be the same height and width as we passed in. So let's wrap our button in a sized box. Okay, now we should set the height and the width. I will make the height be 40 and the width to be $.infinity. When the width of something is set to $.infinity, it will try to take up as much space as possible, which is exactly what we need. Okay, now let's save this so our app would reload. And this looks pretty good. But now let's add a little container between these two to add some space between them. Okay, now this looks a lot better. Now we need to implement the logging in functionality. This is not how you would usually log in using any kind of API, but since we're using the JSON placeholder, we cannot do it the way it's usually done. Here we'll fetch all the users from the JSON placeholder and check if the username that was entered matches any of the usernames from the API. If it matches, we'll let the user through, but if it doesn't, we're going to display an error. First, we'll add the HTTP package. This is going to simplify our HTTP requests. Let's go to our pubspec.yaml file and paste in the name of the dependency and the version. I'm using the latest version at the time of recording this, and you should do that too. So let me now just save so our dependencies would be retrieved. Okay, now let's create a file called apiservice.dart and also create the API service class inside of it. Here we will write all our network requests. In this series we'll keep all the network requests in one place, but if you're creating an app that needs a lot of API calls, you should probably split that into multiple classes. So the first request we're going to create is to get a list of users. So let's create a static method called getUserList that is going to return a list of dynamic. Okay, now we'll need the HTTP package that we installed, so let's import it over here. Okay, so in our HTTP package we have multiple methods that we can use. In this series we'll cover get, post, put and delete. There are more, but in your day-to-day work you will mostly deal with these four. For getting a list of users, we'll obviously use the get method. In the get method we'll just pass in the URL and assign that to a final response variable. Okay, so now we need to pass in the URL. Since we're going to reuse this URL a lot of times, I'll just here create an empty class called URLs and put in the base API URL. And here we'll just paste in the URL of our JSON placeholder. Alright, now that we have that, let's go back to our API service and use our URL. Let's import this URLs class and set this to base API URL. Now we'll use string interpolation to do basically this. Let me just show you. And just go /users. And also we need to make this method async and also make it a future, so we can use the await operator over here to get our response. Okay, now our response will contain some information that's important for us. For example, it contains the status code, the body, the headers and some other stuff. status code is basically a number that indicates if the request was successful or not. There are a bunch of status code, and of course you don't need to memorize them. Some of the common ones are 200, which means that the request executed successfully, 201, which means that the resource you sent to the API has been created, 404, which means that the resource you were looking for cannot be found, and there's a lot more. If the list of users was successfully retrieved, the API should respond with a status code of 200. So we should check if the status code is 200, and then we'll return our list, and if it's not 200, then we'll just return null. Okay, so the body of our request is going to be in plain text, and we should somehow convert it to a list. Fortunately, there is a JSON decoder built into the Dart standard library, which will convert a raw JSON string into a list of map if the JSON itself is a list, and if it's just a single object, then it will convert it directly to a map. Okay, now let's import our Dart convert library. Now let's use the decode method to decode our response body. Okay, now that that's done, let's go to our widget and use this method. In the onPress method of our login button, we should use our getUserList method to check if the user with the username that we entered even exists. Okay, let's make our onPress method async, and then assign the user's variable to the result of getUserList method. Let's import the API service, and now use the getUserList method. Now we should check if the user's variable is null. If it is, then we'll display a dialog letting our user know that we failed to log him in and return from the onPress method. However, if our getUserList method returned something of use, then we'll use the anyUtility method in order to see if there is a user matching the entered username. Okay, now we need a way to retrieve the value from our text field in order to compare it to all the usernames in our list. For that, we'll use the text editing controller and tie it to our text field. So let's create it as a property of our login state class. Okay, and now to connect this to our text field, we just need to pass it in as the optional parameter in our text box. So let's do that over here, say controller, and just paste in the name of our username controller. And also we need to instantiate it over here. Say equals to new text editing controller and save that. Okay, since now we can retrieve the text from our text field using the controller.text property, we can finish our query. So our utility method returns a boolean that indicates if there are any users in the list matching our clause or not. So we'll use the if statement to determine what to do. So if our user with username exists value is equal to true, we should push the posts page, and if not, we should show the dialog that the username is incorrect. Okay, now let me just create the empty posts widget so we do not get an error anymore. We'll implement that in our next video, so let's just go stateless, and that should be it. And now let's write the code for showing our error dialog. Okay, now that that's done, we should use the isLoading property we declared over here. Since network requests are going to take some time to complete depending on your internet connection, we want to let the user know that there is something going on, and also prevent them from tapping on the login button multiple times, triggering multiple network requests at the same time for no reason. So we're going to check if the isLoading is true. Then we'll display a circular progress indicator, and if it's not loading, then we'll just display our button. Okay, so we use this shortened if statement to determine what to do. Okay, now let's go to our onPress method, and where is it? It's over here. So we should change the value of isLoading property to true while our network request completes. So there we will take advantage of the setState method and change the value of isLoading to true just before the request executes, and right after it's done, we'll set the isLoading to false. Okay, now let's restart the app to see what happens. Okay, now that our app is restarted, let me just input some kind of a username. Let me go to the JSON placeholder and see what kind of users we have. So we have a user with the username Brett with the first, I don't know if you can see it, let me actually zoom in. So we have a user with username Brett. So let's type that in and try and log in. And it just got us this black screen, which is our posts page. So let's go back and put some different username and try and log in, and it says incorrect username. Okay, but now what will happen if we do not have internet access? Let me disable mobile data over here and try and log in. Okay, so over here in the debug console you can see that we get an exception thrown, and it's the socket exception. It says failed host lookup JSON placeholder dot typical dot whatever. That basically means that it could not find the URL since we do not have internet access. In order to fix this, we should just wrap our HTTP request in a try catch. And over here, if the exception gets thrown, we should just return null. Okay, now let's restart the app and check if this works. Okay, now app is reloaded once again. Let me just input some random text and click login. And it will say error checking your internet connection because we returned null in this catch body over here. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the first part. In the second part, we'll draw out our posts page and implement the fetching logic behind it.